My name is Alice Obrecht, and I'm a research fellow at ALNAP and colleague to Leah Campbell, the research officer who coordinates ALNAP's Urban Response Community of Practice and who has been working with the ICRC to organize this event today. Just a few notes of housekeeping before we get started. If you could please remember to turn off those mobile phones, or ideally switch it to silent so that you can tweet away about this event. When tweeting, if you could please use the hashtag Urban Response, which is posted up on the screens to my left. And for those of you who are joining us online, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you and say that we look forward to receiving your questions and comments during the Q&A session. So this event is the official launch of a new report by the ICRC entitled Urban Services During Protracted Armed Conflict, a call for a better approach to assisting affected people. You should see a copy of this at your chair. This report is coming out at a very critical time. Humanitarians are increasingly having to respond in urban settings. This is not news to anyone. And yet, as this report mentions, and as ALNAP's work on urban responses indicated, humanitarian organizations are still lagging behind in adapting their modes of operation to the urban context. Simultaneously, as highlighted by the 2015 State of the Humanitarian System report and several other reports from this past year, we are seeing a significant rise in conflict-driven protracted crises as a larger proportion of the overall humanitarian caseload. So, in short, there are more urban crises and there are more protracted crises driven by armed conflict, both of which are challenging current international aid structures, funding mechanisms, and approaches to assisting people in crisis. This report brings these two perspectives together to look at the catastrophic impacts of protracted armed conflict in urban settings. It offers a vision for how humanitarians, development actors, and others need to change in order to serve and protect affected people more effectively in these types of crisis. Now, perhaps because we're on the cusp of a World Humanitarian Summit, there are many reports and briefing papers that have come out in the past year calling for a paradigm shift in how we address protracted crises. However, it is very rare to see one of these calls for a new paradigm that actually provides clear, novel, and specific analysis on what that paradigm shift would entail. But luckily for us, this report provides precisely that kind of analysis, and we are especially lucky today to have the opportunity to hear from two of the co-authors of this report who will be talking us through their analysis, as well as two distinguished colleagues with expertise on urban humanitarian response who will be helping us analyze and discuss the key arguments of that report. So to introduce the distinguished panelists, starting with the two co-authors of this report, Michael Talami, who is the Regional Water and Habitat Advisor for the Near and Middle East region for the ICRC. Through this role, Michael has supported the ICRC's water and habitat programs in the region, including in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Yemen. Prior to joining the ICRC, Michael has worked as a technical policy advisor for several organizations, as well as an environmental engineer. So welcome to Michael. Dr. Mark Zaytoun is the founder of the University of East Anglia Water Security Research Center and reader at the School of International Development at University of East Anglia. Previously, Mark worked as a humanitarian aid water engineer and advisor on water security policy, hydro diplomacy, and transboundary water negotiations in conflict and post-conflict zones throughout Africa and the Middle East. And so Mark and Michael will do a collective presentation for about 20-25 minutes on the report, and then we're going to hear from two respondents, starting with Paul Shanahan, who is the former IASC Global WASH Cluster Coordinator. Paul has over 40 years of public, private sector, and non-governmental experience in WASH, including his most recent position as the Global WASH Cluster Coordinator from 2012 to 2014. He also has extensive field experience in WASH and WASH coordination in both natural disaster and conflict contexts. And then finally, we have Dr. Lucy Earl, who's joining us through video teleconference from New York City. Lucy is the Urban Policy Advisor for the UK Department for International Development. She is currently leading the UK government's Urban Crises Program. She also co-leads the Urban Expert Group for the World Humanitarian Summit and is working as an urban technical advisor both for UK DFID and through a part-time secondment to the IRC. So we have a very distinguished panel, a lot of rich material to discuss, and I will not take any more time, but instead hand directly over to Michael and Mark.
Thanks, Alice, for the introduction. I'd like to thank LNAP and ODI as well, and all of our guests that have come here to be here with us today, as well as the distinguished panel, Paul Shanahan, who's come all the way from Australia to be with us for this one-day event, and Dr. Mark Zaytoun. At this stage, I'd like to complement a little bit of what Alice said from an ICRC perspective anyway, to give you an indication as to why the ICRC has decided to release this report and why at this period of time. So, as Alice had mentioned, there's definitely been a sharp increase in the number of armed conflicts that have been playing out in urban areas, and several of those conflicts are now running in parallel and have a protracted nature. And so the ICRC, realizing that many other organizations have documented and put something into the public space in terms of the urban response, be it in armed conflicts or natural disasters, or outside in terms of the refugee response in countries like Lebanon and Jordan, wanted to contribute based on 30 years of operational experience on the ground to really highlight some of the challenges that we see in being able to respond effectively to the needs on the ground. In addition to that, in many conflicts, the asymmetry in power that we've noticed, there's been an insufficient respect for the applicable laws or rules of international humanitarian law, and increasingly we've seen a shrinking humanitarian space, which is in part a result of the lack of safe access that humanitarians have to various areas of the conflict. As a result, there's unprecedented needs, and those needs are increasing and becoming more geographically distributed, both within the conflict and in neighboring countries in cases like Syria. In urban areas, the needs now span the full spectrum from what classically could be referred to as humanitarian or emergency work to development. And mainly this is what this report really highlights, is the crux of the issue that large-scale essential services or infrastructure often requires more of a development style approach. On top of these protracted conflicts, it's made even more difficult to deliver assistance in some settings when you have the impact of international sanctions, embargoes, and other restrictions on the trade and importation or delivery of goods, specifically destined or necessary for water, sanitation, and energy-related services. And an inadequate provision of essential services pose a significant risk to health as well as facilitating displacement, two issues that we hold at kind of the center of the response that we have. Finally, I'd like to take a second just to outline the various areas of the call, to bring it to your attention at the beginning, but we will unpack it through the next two presentations, which will start with Mark, and then I will continue. So first, we're calling for a paradigm to replace the relief, rehabilitation, development continuum. Second, a strengthening in terms of the compliance with IHL. Third, the impact of the deterioration of essential urban services, specifically on public health. And this one will take a lot of emphasis in the second presentation, more related to operations and practice in terms of including the length of current planning periods, relationships with local actors and the local population, and technical capacity and competencies. Some shortcomings that we see both internally within the ICRC as well as outside in terms of the broader response. And the flexibility and duration of funding schemes and structures, and finally, further research to address knowledge gaps in support of the issues listed above. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Mark for now.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Is this mic on? Great. Okay, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about, I'm going to cover 3 topics today. First of all, methodology, and then I'll introduce 3 concepts and then elaborate a little bit more on the evidence and database that Michael just mentioned. It's my duty to tell you about the methodology, so hold on to your hats. This is really exciting. This report is a result of numerous roundtables with the authors. It's also based on a essentially comprehensive review of literature that we undertook with 5 research assistants about 2 years ago, and upon which we drew upon ALNAP's database significantly for. We also reviewed internal ICRC literature from operations in the water department in Iraq from 1991 to 2014, box loads of internal communication, and in Gaza from 2006 to 2014. We also had group interviews with the Iraq Watsan coordinators through these decades and with the Gaza water coordinators through the 8 years. And then we used inductive reasoning to develop the conceptual framework. So we had ideas, we tested it on the cases of Gaza and Iraq, Syria and Libya, and then we refined our ideas. We then tested it on 20 plus regional water coordinators from outside of the Middle East. We ran the ideas past ODI and ALNAP here in April of last year. And then we had to run it through the ICRC house, through protection, through the legal departments, and through the health departments. And that strengthened the report considerably. So there have been 60 different versions of this report, but we finally got it into print. Some of the findings, well, we found, for instance, in the review of literature, there is a lot written about humanitarian work in rural areas, much less on urban areas. But increasingly, as Alice was pointing out, there is actually great interest and a lot of published literature on urban activities, especially from the British Red Cross, Groupe IRD, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, the Center for Urban Conflict Research, ALNAP and ODI, IASC. Everyone has an urban initiative these days. Our particular angle is about urban services during protracted conflict. So the focus is services during protracted conflict. So not acute conflicts, not natural disasters, and not just water, but urban services generally. And some of the findings reinforce what many others have said, but from our particular angle. So we're building on the work of others. And others offer new insights into the breadth and depth of the challenge. And I'll kick off with a few of these conceptual contributions, if you will. And they seem blindingly obvious once you've written the report, but urban services are composed of 3 critical components: people, hardware, and consumables. And all of those are intertwined. You can't have good service delivery if you don't have the people, if there's a brain drain happening, for example. And likewise, if the people don't have any chlorine treatment or bandages or medical equipment to deliver, the service falls apart. And certainly amongst the 3, the most irreplaceable component is the people. That's what we've found. Secondly, what do we mean when we're talking about urban? And there has been a lot of literature on this. Urban is not just the city limits, of course. And from our particular angle, we were interested in all these services that supply people that reside within the city limits, within the municipal limits. And so that can include, obviously, water and wastewater, electricity to run all those plants, as well as basic needs for the people, health, food, finances, electronic and digital flows as well. And so all of these services are interconnected, just like the components of each service are interconnected. And urban extends beyond the city, but not just in space, but along these supply routes of digital or actual transportation routes. And so the definition that we're proposing for urban context, which we're moving forward with, is the area within which civilians vulnerable to disruptions in these essential services reside, and the network of components supporting those services. So it's a bit of a prickly pear, if you will. And the third concept I wanted to draw attention to that's elaborated upon in the report is about measuring and conceiving the quality of a service and the impact upon the people. So if you assume that a service, let's say a water service, was roughly 80% or 90% good before armed conflict hits. Armed conflict happens, has some direct damages to a water treatment plant or to a pumping station. The quality of the service, in terms of the number of people covered, drops. Humanitarians come in, apply some Band-Aids, rehabilitate a booster station, bring the quality of the service back up to a fraction of what it was, maybe 70%. But then armed conflict hits again. And then if sanctions come in and stop the line of consumables, or if the conflict continues over time and people start drifting away, especially technical people, then the quality of the service gradually declines, and the traditional relief responses, so the Band-Aids, which I'm calling them, are no longer able to stop the decline of the service to a point that it becomes irreversible, let's say. That much we know, and we could gather as much from the internal ICRC documents on an issue. If you watch a conflict over 15, 20 years, we're pretty confident about the shape of this graph. But when it comes time to measuring the impact of this decline in services on people, it's a very different affair. You've got certainly things at the beginning of a conflict get worse quickly, but people then develop coping mechanisms and adapt to a situation, and possibly the impact is slowed down somewhat. And then we know from experience, but it's much harder to put accurate figures on it, that at some point, again, beyond a certain point, things do get worse again. Now I'm talking generally, measuring impact generally, but what we should do is measure impact specifically in some way, like in terms of public health, risks of communicable diseases, or livelihoods or well-being. Okay, and then this is the last slide. Some of the evidence base that we think is required to support this call that we're making. Some of it is required for better programming, and some of it is required for better operations. So we can begin to collect data on staff absences to track the brain drain. We can collect data on water disruptions. We can begin to pinpoint critical weaknesses that make a service vulnerable or resilient. And all of that can feed, for instance, into risk analysis that will help to shape the design of our programs. And field workers can certainly collect that type of data. The more policy-oriented research is we have to begin auditing the knock-on effects of direct damages. So that's what Michael will elaborate upon, which we call indirect damages. We also have to begin to understand how to gauge the impact of a single or repeated disruption, not just a degradation of a service. And then, interestingly, how and for whom do coping mechanisms reduce impact? Because as we elaborate upon in the report, some coping mechanisms can serve some parts of an urban area well, but at the expense of others. So it can actually increase the vulnerability of other people. And all of that type of research should support the case for more flexible funding and increased capacity amongst agencies that Michael will elaborate upon a little bit further. I'll leave it there and pass over to Michael.
So just as they're loading the presentation, thanks, Mark. The 30 years of experience that we've tried to attempt to distill down to this report is one that's provided a reflection that is just as applicable to the ICRC and how we plan to move forward as we hope it is to other humanitarian actors, but also in relation to the interface between humanitarian and development actors and humanitarian and the donors more broadly. So I'd like you to keep that in mind over the next couple of slides. I'll start by building on what some of Mark has mentioned, and that's really the path as we see it to a better approach. And this is first with as we look outside now of the ICRC, is really trying to garner more of a common understanding or recognition of the sheer scale of the crisis that is unfolding on parallel fronts, be it in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Ukraine, or other conflicts as well, like Libya, that are all basically taking place at the same time. And really, that has allowed us to induce, in terms of our thinking at least, a shift in our thinking. But to somewhat test this on a broader audience, that's one of the reasons why we've come here to ODI, is to reach out to a broader audience of practitioners, but also to really emphasize the fact that it's not a one-off initiative. It's not enough, obviously, just to issue the report and then take a step back. It's something that is going to be a process that we plan to take forward, and we plan and hope that basically there'll be a lot of other actors that will be just as engaged on a bilateral or multilateral front as they see fit. So to start with is the recognition of the sheer scale of the challenge. And the next points, basically, I'll have a slide for each one, so we'll go through them one at a time. But before I do that, I would like to take a stab, basically, at showing an oversimplification, an animated infographic that tries to simplify this report down to its very basics. It's about 2 minutes long. It's still a work in progress. But it will be interesting for us, either during the question and answer period or potentially afterwards in the reception time, to kind of get some feedback from you on where the strengths and weaknesses are of the infographic. So it's just a draft at this time, but we would like to share it, and please, if you could play it. So here I think it's bringing a multitude of issues basically together into trying at least to take a stab at a very simplified version of the issues that we're talking about. And even over the course of this hour and a half, it will be hard to go into the depth of the information that's provided and the understanding that we have now in terms of this report. Obviously, it's been made available to you and it will be made available online. The infographic builds a little bit on what Mark has already mentioned, and now I'd like to carry it forward a little bit, but making references back to it. So to start with is really the scale of the challenge, and we'll look at these with the critical parts that Mark had already introduced in terms of hardware, people, and consumables. So in terms of hardware, the infrastructure and the machinery, we're not talking about the old style responses, which are still relevant in some contexts, obviously, of tap stands and the old Oxfam style water tanks, but really large scale infrastructure. So here a large scale transmission line or electrical substations. And then the machinery and the technical staff that are needed to actually do the construction related work requires not only expertise but large machinery to be able to execute this work. Consumables, here, quantity, transport, and delivery, obviously affected by, at times, sanctions or embargoes or other restrictions, but also it requires a massive logistical capacity to be able to deliver the necessary quantities of consumables and materials that are necessary for urban services, especially when a conflict is as widespread as one, for instance, in Syria, which extends to almost all of the governorates in the country. People, so operators, technicians, repair crews, and other staff. And here, I think Mark has said it very well. The extensive body of knowledge of these systems really rest with the service providers themselves. And it's extremely difficult to replace that capacity, either due to a brain drain or to the fact that it's difficult to get people to the field because of a lack of safe access. In terms of the challenge itself, here the infographic again went through this. These are just some protracted humanitarian interventions that we could see that run quite a long period of time and consecutively, with peaks and wanes in the intensity, obviously, of the conflicts, for instance, Gaza. In terms of the direct impacts, and this I'll spend less time on because this is the one that's really the most visible in the media, but also the most visible in terms of the response that humanitarian actors mainly focus on in these protracted conflicts. So the destruction of infrastructure. Here, for instance, a reservoir, could be other infrastructure, obviously. Here, we didn't have a picture to show of the destruction of consumables, but these are dosing tanks, the chlorine that's used to treat water. This is basically the response afterwards that we had to put in place. And then the people. The people, obviously, the technicians require safe access. The ICRC, one organization that tries to provide that with the emblem of the ICRC, and this is a picture basically with a local municipal water board and their front-end loaders and technicians and engineering crew that we've escorted out to a site during an active conflict. But what we hear a lot less about is really, what we hear a lot less about is really the indirect impacts. But before I go there, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other direct impacts that we would see that might fall out of the water, sanitation, and energy services specifically, but that are linked. So for instance, all of those support hospitals. Those services also need to be extended to hospitals, and repairs need to be done at hospitals. Transportation routes, if bombed out, inhibit the ability to access areas. Service provider control rooms, something that's often not thought about. It's more the infrastructure, but also damages to the office spaces or control rooms of service providers. And then warehouses. which are absolutely critical. If it's for a water, sanitation, or electrical service provider or company, what enables them to respond quickly are their stocks that they have. And typically those stocks are more substantial than the stocks that humanitarian organizations will have. And the lead time for the replacement of some of these parts, for instance, like pumps, could be 3 to 6 months. So you really need to safeguard and have an adequate stock available. But I'd like to focus a little bit more on the indirect impact, which is difficult to show in pictures, because when you look back throughout the last 30 years, at least internally, we often take more pictures of the direct impact, even though we're actually focused on the indirect, or trying to focus on the indirect impact. So here, in terms of infrastructure, this is a picture to show, one, the scale of some of the infrastructure that we're talking about for urban areas. Large scale pumping station. Here, extensive discussions taking place between ICRC engineers as well as service provider engineers and technicians, and you can kind of see the deteriorated state of the infrastructure in this picture and a little bit closer in this picture. So it's really an emphasis that as conflicts become protracted, there's often a neglect, a widespread neglect in the maintenance, the repairs, and the proper operation of essential services. And this can become so extensive that, as Mark had said, you can get to a point of almost no return, where no matter what efforts you put into it, you will not get the service back or be able to stabilize it until after the conflict has actually ended. And the point there as well is that investments made to combat this save money in the long run once the conflict is ended, in terms of the sheer development costs that need to be put in afterwards for whole systems instead of parts of systems. And here another example is looting. So here a pump house has been completely looted. We've seen this in other conflicts in terms of wastewater treatment plants or small dams and weirs, all sorts of water-related installations.
2 minutes.
So the cumulative impact of the combination of the indirect and the direct impact is really what we wanted to emphasize here. And this is something that you'll all have in the report and you can look at, and we unpack a little bit more about what we mean in terms of indirect impact with people, so service providers, and the fact that often salaries are not even paid to these service providers in protracted conflicts. When they don't have cost recovery, they lose channels of funding from potentially the development side or even the central government, and they're basically left on their own for prolonged periods of time with some help by the limited number of actors that you see, humanitarian actors on the ground. And this leads back then to a point where service decline starts to impact public health when there's prolonged exposure, and obviously the risks with that potentially fuel further conflict. So here, just a couple slides left. Another point in terms of the politics of a highly securitized operating environment. I alluded to this in the introduction, where we see a shrinking humanitarian space and a lack of safe access. And here, often internally, we say, innovation in technology is important, but innovative approaches is really what the humanitarian world needs to focus on in such conflicts that we see today, in terms of being able to reach out to victims of armed conflict that are in areas that are inaccessible due to a lack of safe access. So security constraints require most humanitarian actors to work a step removed from the actual armed conflict. We see fewer humanitarian actors actually within the conflict zone and more on the periphery or in neighboring countries. Challenges faced as a result of the lack of respect for the rules of IHL. This is something that is obviously important and wouldn't be an ICRC report if we didn't refer back to it. Here, IHL provides protection for civilian objects, be it water or sanitation, or the energy installations that are required basically to operate this infrastructure. But there's several key challenges that still arise in part from the lack of respect for IHL and the weaponry used in urban areas. And I won't go too far into it now if there's interest in terms of questions and answers, but I will say that the ICRC is already working on this and trying to strengthen compliance with IHL, particularly through its work on explosive weapons in populated areas that shows that some weapons can have humanitarian consequences that go far beyond the actual impact zone that we see. And these are reverberating effects on essential services that we're referring to. So finally, a call for a better approach to assisting affected people. Here, I'll leave this up. I think, I've mentioned already this call in the introduction. These are the main points. You'll be able to read more, as well as I think that putting it out to questions and answers will allow us to have a healthier discussion on these points. And I look forward and like to thank the two guests that we have that will provide from their extensive experience their first critique of the report and the main issues that we raise in the report. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Michael and Mark. So a very interesting overview of the content of the report, and just to pull out, I think, this framework that you've developed, which is really quite a novel and an innovative look at these things. There's been a lot of people talking about how we need to reorient our perspective around the point of view of the affected person. And I think in your report, by focusing on services, you've done that to a large extent for the urban and protracted conflict context. And then you're offering this framework of how we should understand services by dividing into hardware, people, and consumables, and then looking at these three different forms of impact that can occur and influence or break down those three elements of the service through the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. So really helpful framework, clear framework to help us talk about some of these issues. So I'm going to hand over now to Paul, who will give his reaction to the report. Paul, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Well, the Humanitarian WASH community owes a debt of gratitude to the ICRC for helping us come to grips with this. We've all been subject to a growing awareness of how the size, complexity, and duration of urban conflict impacting on WASH services creates challenges that we have increasingly struggled with and have not really made the sort of progress that we would expect of ourselves. So the ICRC is due credit a number of ways. Firstly, for foreseeing this and getting to work some time ago in identifying the capacity that needed to be built within the organisation, identifying ways of working, and then capturing those lessons and putting them in front of us. So, I mean, this is hugely important. It's also profoundly important, in my view, that the findings of the work that's in front of us are unambiguously calling for a changed paradigm. Because I think what we're seeing now and what's leading to some of our present frustration in trying to deal with these huge conflicts and the impacts on huge numbers of people leading to huge displacements is the fact that we're stalled. We've actually reached the limits of what we can do by adjusting the existing resources and the existing roles and the existing coordination mechanisms and the existing actors in a way to do better. We're not, I mean, the incremental tinkering is not getting us where we need to go. And I mean, I think it's quite clear that the call for a new paradigm is well-founded. That's great. So the ICRC have done a great deal of work and put this in front of us. And now the ball actually, or the responsibility, moves to the broader WASH community to say, well, what are we going to do? Like, how the case is made, we need a new paradigm. What does it look like? What do we do? I mean, where do we go from here? Because the courteous point at which the ICRC stopped was to say, here is our experience. They refrained from lecturing, dictating, being overly proactive in saying what the rest of the community should do, because it's a complex, the WASH community is a complex community with differing mandates, differing driving forces, and differing interests and differing capacities. So the ICRC has put it there in front of us. The question to the rest of us now is, what do we do? Like, are we happy to remain stalled? No, we're not. And we've been dancing around this for a considerable amount of time, looking at what do we do? What do we do? Urban emergencies are huge. They're impacting us. We're losing ground. We're not. Are we really effective in our response? Clearly, looking at the displacements and the lack of servicing, the response, there's ample room to improve the response. So it's up to us now to move forward and think about what this new paradigm might be. The first thing I'd like to think about in terms of a new paradigm, it is only useful to the extent that it gives rise ultimately to new ways of working that produce better outcomes. It is unhelpful to think of elaborate, intricate constructs that don't take us where we need to be. So the only value of the new paradigm is that if it brings about an improvement, which is a result of new ways of thinking, giving ways to new ways of acting, which give us better outcomes. So why are we having these difficulties? And I mean, the speakers that have gone before have given you an excellent potted summary of the drivers for this. But one of the key things from my point of view, and I think I raise it here not to repeat what they've said, but because I think it goes to the heart of what the new paradigm might look like, or one of the elements that's required, is this centralisation of the response. If you look at WASH responses historically, before we arrived at our present situation, we had a multiplicity of actors dealing directly with affected populations. And there were numerous parallel courses that were able to happen. That's not available as a way to address a complex urban response. There is a centralisation of the resource. The only way you get a meaningful response in an urban system is to keep the existing infrastructure functioning to some degree, as much as you can. That doesn't permit actors to operate in parallel, because it is not a matter of the humanitarian community helping affected populations. It is the humanitarian community supporting the utility, the water service provider, the local authorities, the government, to continue doing what they're doing. And you cannot have the situation where every humanitarian actor seeks to engage individually with the water supply utilities, because this is happening at a time when they are sorely stressed, they're losing staff, they're having additional demands placed on the system. The last thing they want is a string of agency representatives outside their door, all wanting to ask them the same questions, and all with varying capabilities to be of help to them. So we need to have this situation where there is a centralisation of the response. So I think one of the elements that goes into our new paradigm is a way to manage this, to build this relationship of confidence and trust with the existing authorities, but in a way that makes it possible for the other components of the humanitarian system to work. The other thing that is a high priority from my point of view is making sure we have the right mix of skills in the right places. Because of the way the humanitarian WASH world has evolved, there tends to be kind of the generic WASH person. And there's a little bit of segregation. You mean, well, there's kind of like the hygiene promotion people, and then there's kind of like the engineering people. And too often for too long, there has been an inability to look more deeply at specialised skills. But it's not every WASH engineer that can engage with a utility official in a way that gains their confidence, that is supportive. Too many times we have the supposed beneficiary saying, I don't have time to teach the humanitarian community how to do this. So we have to focus very, very much on looking at the sorts of skills that we bring to this. And these are senior engineering skills. They need to have good technical background. They need to have some understanding of utility operations. Hopefully have actually worked in a good-sized utility themselves. They have to have some construction experience. They have to know how to write specifications. They have to know how to manage commercial contracts, because the nature of the remediation works are not the sorts of things that you can do with volunteer labour or people working on incentives taken from the affected population. These are things where people need specialised skills, equipment and knowledge to do. The role of the humanitarian community is to bring that in place by writing the specifications, by being the means by which the funding for those operations can be, so that the donors can be reassured that the work is well spent. So this requires a set of skills. So we really need to do a lot of work ourselves on defining those skills and assessing them. So the bad news is we need a lot more skills. The good news is, because of the centralisation of the relationship, you don't need a lot of them. You just need a few. But we have to, so it's finding the skills, I don't think, is the challenge. Finding a situation where we can arrange those skills in a way that we can leverage the capacity of the rest of the humanitarian watch system is the challenge.
2 minutes.
The other thing is, and this is going to mean incorporating new actors. And everything you read on this acknowledges role of the private sector, role of development agencies, role of banks, and that sort of thing. So our new paradigm, it's not mysterious to say, it's no great flash of insight to say we need these skills or these skills are helpful. But where we haven't risen to the challenge is to devise ways of incorporating these skills. So the new paradigm has to pick that up. And then the other thing that we need is the stable and predictable financing. The duration is long, the projects are large. This is not, if a donor is by virtue of their own mandate stuck in a 6-month funding cycle, this helps no one. So we actually need a situation. We actually need to develop a concept of a non-emergency humanitarian response. Our language has been to use the word emergency and humanitarian somewhat interchangeably. Emergency means right away, short term. These humanitarian responses are deeply impacting on people. They're critical, they're driving negative health impacts and displacements, but we need to be able to structure them in such a way that we can actually do this stably. I could go on, but I can't. So thank you very much for the opportunity to get that off my chest, and I leave the challenge to my colleagues now as to how to move this forward, because it would be a shame if this piece of foundational work doesn't lead to more action. I would say that I don't favour the idea of the big analysis and the grand solution. What I would see the way of doing this is a process of evolution, finding little bits that work and getting them to work together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Evolution, not revolution, as the British would say. So thank you very much, Paul. And to complete our responses, we will now go to Lucy to pick up on these points regarding what this new paradigm might look like and reflections on the report. Over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you also to LNAP, ODI, and to the ICRC for the opportunity to speak to you today. Paul has given you the WASH perspective. You're now going to get more of an urbanist perspective on this report. And I want to start by saying how much, as DFID, we welcome this and the focus that the ICRC is bringing to the specific complexities of working in urban areas affected by conflict. As noted in the report, they have decades of experience working in these very challenging urban contexts, and it's important that we are now sort of learning about this, that this process of communication has begun, and that we're initiating a discussion on the issues. And the report is particularly pertinent for DFID, given our focus on the conflict in Syria and the work we are doing there and in neighbouring countries that are affected by the conflict. And the relevance of the report is clear, given what we know about the damage and deliberate destruction of water and power infrastructure within Syria. Reports earlier this year indicating that over 7 million people had reduced access to water in parts of the north of the country as a result of deliberate cuts to water and power. But the report also mentions the fact that population movements within countries affected by conflict puts further strain on damaged networks and critical infrastructure. And I think that's also an important point to pick up on, the knock-on effects of conflict on neighbouring countries. We know that the strain on service provision and the difficulty people have in accessing fulfilling their basic needs has been transposed onto urban areas in neighbouring countries to Syria, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan. And we know that often people who've moved from urban areas in Syria have gone to urban areas in these neighbouring countries. But these municipalities are struggling to absorb additional populations and to provide basic urban services and to maintain these services. And I think we should also consider how this situation has further knock-on effects into Europe as well. I think the in-depth research has yet to be done on migration flows from Syria into the Middle East and then on into Europe. But there are hypotheses that the refugees that we see coming into Europe now this is a secondary migration, and that Syrian refugees whose assets have been depleted within, having moved to urban areas in Lebanon and Jordan, assets are depleted, no longer really able to access the services they need, and now moving on into Europe. So I think what this report has triggered in my mind, for someone who's quite urban-centric, is to look at the ways in which towns and cities affected by conflict are still linked into other towns and cities nationally and internationally. So it's important to consider these cities in their national and international contexts. So I think in terms of appropriate humanitarian response, we've got to understand not just migration flows from rural into urban areas, but between urban areas in one country and then beyond. And the report also highlights, as has been mentioned, the dependence of urban areas on infrastructure outside their municipal boundaries and on national and international markets for goods and services that maintain critical infrastructure. So I wanted just to return to the case of Lebanon and Jordan, where I think the strain on municipal service provision as a result of the refugee influxes is increasingly recognised. And if it has been for several years now, been working with municipal authorities in Jordan and in Lebanon as well, to support local authorities to provide municipal services. But I'd say this is still pretty small scale. And it's also quite difficult. I think as a donor, we tend to work with national governments. We have less experience of working with municipal authorities, where capacity does tend to be weaker. And it's a different pace of work with these authorities than humanitarians are used to. Longer time frames to work on and a different pace. And I think more has to be done about within the humanitarian development communities about how you provide these types of services in urban areas quickly in a crisis situation, but in a collaborative way where you're strengthening existing systems. So I wanted to move on to speak about DFID's Urban Crises Programme that I'm leading on. We have two partners in this. It's the International Rescue Committee, where I'm part-time seconded, as Alice mentioned, and also the International Institute for Environment and Development. And with these two partners, with the IRC, what we're working on is improving the enabling policy environment so that humanitarian and development actors have a greater understanding of the importance of tailoring humanitarian response to the urban context. And through IIED, through a grant-making programme, we're really trying to build the capability, confidence and understanding of DFID and partners to work in urban areas affected by crises. And through my work with the IRC, I'm co-leading an urban expert group, which over the past 18 months has been developing recommendations for the World Humanitarian Summit, which will be held in May 2016. And also for Habitat 3, which is the big urban conference that's held every 20 years, which is scheduled for October 2016. And we're using the timing of these conferences as hooks to start the conversation and start galvanizing some action around urban crises. We're developing recommendations for these conferences, but actually what we really want as a group is to see some of these recommendations put into practice. And I wanted to point out that our focus has been mainly on urban areas affected by natural disasters and by refugee influxes. But we recognise that the impact of conflict on urban areas was a big gap in our conversation amongst the urban expert group and in our knowledge. And without actually being aware that the ICRC was developing this report, DFID, along with the US State Department Bureau for Population, Refugees and Migration, submitted a proposal for the Red Cross International Conference in December to look precisely at how you do safe programming in urban areas affected by conflict and looking at experiences. So this is, we are very pleased that this proposal was accepted, and we're now designing this side event. And it's obviously a great opportunity to further the conversation that's been started today. So in the time I have remaining, I just wanted to point out quite how much I think there's overlap between the recommendations emerging from the report that we're looking at today and the recommendations that have emerged from discussions with the Urban Expert Group over the past 18 months or so. So within the group, we've been looking at the dependence of urban populations on systems, so economic infrastructure, market systems, political systems, the interdependence of these systems and their complexity, and the fact that this requires a new way of working. It requires a much broader array of actors to be involved, including municipal authorities, service providers, utility companies, and other private sector actors. We talk about the need to take advantage of the opportunities present in urban areas, dynamic entrepreneurial population who are generally more literate and can be better connected. The need to take a developmental approach and to be informed by these longer term perspectives right from the start of an emergency response. Recognizing that traditional approaches, so temporary fixes and temporary, for example, in the water or shelter sector, and other sectors can do long-term damage to the urban fabric and to urban economies. We need to move away from the silo mentality and think about intersectoral, multi-sectoral programming and coordination, working with and building on existing systems. And then this issue of technical expertise. We've been talking about the need for surge support, not just to UN agencies, the Humanitarian Country Team, or to NGOs, but also to think about how you surge support into municipalities. So technical support, but sometimes even just the basic support to keep a city going affected by a crisis, the basic administrative functions that are needed. And finally, the question of supporting municipalities to absorb refugees and IDP populations to find solutions that are not camp-based. And I think those who've read the report, and obviously the authors of it, will see that there's quite a lot of similarities in these recommendations coming from the Urban Expert Group and those laid out in the report. I mean, obviously the fact that the authors are looking at cities affected directly by conflict means there are some really specific challenges in collaborating with municipal authorities, the need to remain independent and neutral, and crucially to be perceived as such, are perhaps even, of course, even more critical in these contexts. But I think together, I'm really seeing quite a coalescing of agreement that working with systems can potentially reach huge numbers of people, limit the need for further humanitarian assistance, reduce dependency, and clearly good value for money. So I'd like to really give credit to ICRC that they're taking this approach, the systems approach, working with development actors where possible with development approaches in the most challenging of contexts. But I do think there are more similarities and differences between the findings coming out of the ICRC's work and the discussions that we've been having around natural disasters and refugee contexts. So I think the lessons are useful not just for these conflict-affected cities, but more broadly.
1 minute.
I think also credit to ICRC to be moving beyond the description of complexity and actually, as Alice pointed out in her introduction, to be detailing some potential solutions. And the authors note that, I quote, "Few have chosen to rise to or even conceptualize the challenge of working in urban areas." I would like to hope that DFID's Urban Crises Programme is encouraging a wider array of actors to rise to this challenge. And I welcome the start of this dialogue with the ICRC, and I look forward to some more fruitful exchange in future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucy. So I think we're starting to get some sketches here of what this new paradigm might look like, that we need to be looking more at prevention of cumulative impacts. It's about building relationships of trust with local actors, leveraging the capacity of the humanitarian system to capitalize on more technical skills, predictable financing, working more across sectors with development actors, with a diverse range of actors in the urban context, and then also looking at this issue of scale that Lucy was also highlighting at the end here about the indirect impacts that can occur across boundaries in different urban areas, and so trying to look at parallel at all of these different urban areas simultaneously to understand the knock-on effects of an individual crisis. So a lot of rich information to start off with. I'm going to turn now to our audience for what must be many burning questions, I'm sure, and also look at our internet audience to see if there's any questions online. So a couple of things for question and answer. First of all, if you happen to be joining us from a development organization, we would really love to hear your reflections on these presentations and these issues in particular. If you're not from a development organization, that's fine. You can still ask a question or offer your comments. We welcome that. If you could offer your name and the organization that you're with, as well as indicate who your question is for from the panelists. So, who would like to be first?